I think that it's obvious that there's a lot to be done on mental health policy in this country. Unfortunately, if you were to try and think of the single worst time to have that conversation, it would most likely be in association with violent crime and gun violence. Because the fact of the matter is, people with psychiatric and neurological disabilities are no more likely to be committing violent crime than the general population. And when we look at mental health policy reform from the prism of violence, we end up with bad mental health policy.
But are you suggesting that addressing mental illness and the problems of care have no role to play in the gun control debate, or in the debate about mass gun shootings?
Well, I'm suggesting that if we're talking about what drives this kind of violence, it's not people with psychiatric disabilities. And it's certainly not the kind of proposals that have been put forward. The NRA talking about a national database of people with mental illness, New York State Legislature extending a forced treatment law that many advocates find particularly concerning, putting more police officers in school and potentially furthering the school-to-prison pipeline.
What effect did the focus on Asperger's syndrome have after the Newtown massacre?
Well, a number of folks reported, from our membership, reported an increase in discrimination. Many families reported that schools were now looking at their children with additional suspicion. People who had perhaps recently made the decision to come out of the closet about their diagnosis at work or in their relationships suddenly started to feel that that may have been a mistake and that discrimination might be on the rise. One of the things that I found particularly concerning is that there was an effort on the part of some to try and say, well, we don't really need to have a conversation about gun violence in this country. All we need to do is have a conversation about people with psychiatric disabilities. And frankly, that's not the case. If we look at the research and the evidence, there's no relation between Asperger's syndrome and violent crime. If we look at the broader scope of disability, say another diagnosis, psychiatric disability or mental illness, we find a similar lack of correlation. In fact, even when we look at the small subset of people with psychiatric disabilities who some studies have found to have an increased correlation with violent crime, that correlation disappears when we control for substance abuse. And that's actually one of the only things that does tend to correlate with violent behavior, a history of substance abuse, but not so much a mental illness or an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis.
Is there any correlation, for example, between, I think the study's just been done, between the availability of psychiatric beds and gun violence?
Absolutely no connection. And this is important because many commentators in the aftermath of Newtown decided to blame deinstitutionalization. And one of the great civil rights success stories in disability policy over the course of the last 30, 40 years has been moving people with disabilities out of institutions and into the community. Tom Perez, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Obama administration, he said during his installation ceremony in 2009 that segregating people with disabilities in institutions is as wrong as segregating African American children in inferior schools.
President Obama also talked about Project Aware, and he described it as this, as schools working with law enforcement and mental health agencies to ensure that those showing mental health strains can get help. But clearly there's that law enforcement role. Should law enforcement have a role when it comes to the delivery of mental health care, do you think?
Well, I think we have a great police force in this country, but it runs into problems when we ask it to do things that they're not trained to do, and frankly, that police officers don't want to do. Police officers aren't mental health care professionals, and they're not educators. And their interests and students' interests are going to be better served by approaching the job of the police as law enforcement and the job of the school system as education and the job of the mental health system, which, yes, we do need to fund more effectively.
Why do you think, then, there is this focus on and this consensus on the issue of mental health care then after something like Newtown, as opposed to other issues?
The gun lobby is powerful, and the disability rights lobby is considerably less so. And that, I would say, describes a considerable portion of it. I mean, let's be honest here. It is very difficult to have meaningful legislative action on some of the broader issues relating to gun violence. People would like to believe that this problem lies with some kind of other. And you see this in a lot of instances, okay? When there's an instance of violent crime involving, say, an African American or Hispanic youth, people start talking about gang violence. When there's an instance of violent crime involving Muslim Americans, people talk about terrorism. When the shooter is a Caucasian male, people suddenly look to psychiatric or neurological disability because it's some way of saying the problem isn't here at home, the problem is over there with those kinds of people. That's wrong. It also leads to terrible public policy.